So, hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. So, you need API security, now what? The ultimate guide to building an excellent API security program. My name is Katie Watson. I'll be your host today representing Sequon. For those of you who don't know who Sequon is, we're a cybersecurity solutions provider helping organizations of all sizes secure their digital environments. Our mission is to empower organizations to take control of their security challenges with confidence. And I'm very excited today as the webinar is brought to you in partnership with Traceable, an innovative company at the forefront of API security. Traceable offers cutting-edge solutions that helps organizations discover, secure, and monitor their APIs, which, as we all know, is the backbone of modern digital infrastructure. So I'm very excited today to welcome our featured speaker, Dr. Katie Paxton-Fear, a principal security researcher at Traceable and a widely recognized expert in API security. Katie is an ethical hacker, content creator, and educator with a PhD in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And if you don't know Katie, for her academic achievements, you may know her as Insider PhD, a YouTuber with a thriving community of over 80,000 followers, where she shares her passion for ethical hacking. She's hacked everything from social media platforms to military systems, and we're very lucky today to have her here to share her unique insight into the challenges and solutions of API security. So before we dive into the session, just a few bits of housekeeping rules. The webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes with some time for a Q&A at the end. So if you do have a question throughout, please drop them in the Q&A box and we're going to try to answer as many as we can. Now, if you missed something, don't worry. The session is being recorded and you will get the recording sent to you. And at the end of the session, if you have any feedback, please do get in touch because we would love to hear from you. So without further ado, grab your coffee, sit back, get ready to learn from one of the best API experts out there. And I'd like to hand it over to you, Katie.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I often think of this talk as like the talk the sales team at Traceable hate when I give, because I'm going to recommend a lot of stuff that you do not need to pay for, but it'll hopefully give you an idea of how you can scale up API security from being a problem that you kind of vaguely know you need to do something about into kind of world-class API security. And it doesn't really matter where you are on that journey. You know, if you've got a budget of zero, you've got APIs, you have no idea what they're doing, you can build the first pieces of an API security program without having to spend thousands. Equally, if you're an organization that's already tried a lot of the kind of free or low cost solutions and you're struggling to really mature that going forward, I think this talk also presents a lot of things to think about in the journey when you go from APIs are a problem to API security program. So just to kind of catch everybody up, what is an API? An API is a type of application that's not designed to be consumed by humans. It's designed to be consumed by other applications. Best way to think of it, waiter at a restaurant. The API is the kitchen. You as a customer are the client. And the waiter communicates your order to the kitchen and back again. Now, obviously, between the waiter leaving your table and it arriving at the kitchen, it's like the waiter will walk through an entire room and that can expose it to security problems. Somebody could come and change your order. Somebody could take your order and set it to a different table. Somebody can take put another order in its place, right? So that's what I mean when we mean APIs. And I think the easiest way to think about what I'm talking about when I say APIs is specifically the web context of APIs. So APIs can also be used in like hardware context. But in this case, I'm talking about web APIs. They are the fundamental building blocks of like a ton of modern technology, whether that's microservices, cloud first stuff, or actually just making software easier to use and to make it so you can use a mobile app. The idea being is that you can kind of switch things on and off without breaking everything. Now, if you're thinking, I don't have APIs, I promise you, you already use APIs, even if you don't know it. Some APIs are really, really obvious. Like you've got developer APIs where they have an entire API documentation that says, here's how you're supposed to use it. But even if you're using mobile apps like LinkedIn, that is using an API on the back end. And likely in any organization, your developers have already put APIs out there. You're probably already got APIs, whether that is an API that you publish or an API that maybe a third party publishes. You may not even be aware of the APIs, because really for developers, APIs are really great. So you write one API, you use it everywhere, you standardize it. It's built in and has really wide support in different programming languages. It makes it really easy to integrate. Scaling is a lot easier with depending on what API deployment solution, and it's really developer friendly. Developers love APIs. That can be your developers, but it can also be the developers of literally any organization you partner with or use the software of. They're probably using APIs. And this presents a kind of challenge for people in API security, and hopefully you'll see how we kind of address all these challenges with an API security program. But APIs are ubiquitous. They are everywhere. They exist in first-party applications, in third-party applications, in partners, in customers. They exist all over. And one of the problems with how ubiquitous they are is that they are often led by development teams. So developers own APIs, they update them whenever they want, they fix vulnerabilities whenever they want, they ignore APIs whenever they want. It is very much focused on what they need to solve problems. And this can make it kind of challenging, because any time that you as a security team interfere with the developer, you're actually building quite a lot of animosity between you and the developer. And often with certain like APIs where developers are very used to having a lot of control, taking that control away from them upsets them. It's also really hard to tell the difference between legitimate API traffic and illegitimate traffic. Things like WAFs, web application firewalls, are a great first step for a lot of security teams who deal with user input. But in an API attack, it's not that obvious. There's not these obvious signatures that we see for cross-site scripting or SQL injection. So actually deciding, hey, this is malicious and this is normal is really, really hard. Made even harder if your API is already been exploited. One of I was chatting with a company last week, and they were like, you know, how big is this? Is the API? How bad could it be? What's the worst case scenario if we do have API breaches? One of the worst things that could happen is that you have been exploited for years and have no idea, and people are siphoning off money. They have full access to your user data. They're just taking it to use it for something else. APIs are often assumed to be internal only. A lot of people create APIs thinking the only people that are going to use them are, you know, their colleagues, only to realize that because it's out to the whole internet, it doesn't actually stop at the boundaries of a company. It's available to everybody to use. We have a challenge of frequency of deployment. APIs can be updated multiple times a day. Many APIs lack official documentation, even internally, but certainly externally. APIs don't require a specific expertise, which is kind of weird because I go online and get told I'm an API security expert. But actually, API security doesn't require specific knowledge. It's very similar to web applications, but instead of trying something like SQL injection or cross-site scripting where you're inputting payloads, instead you're looking at how the application works and trying to break it. It's a lot more fraud and thinking like a bad guy than it is, you know, super obvious. Here's the attack. And finally, the unknown attack surface. Because APIs are ubiquitous, because they're led by developers, because they are so frequently deployed, because they are assumed to be internal only, most organizations do not know how many APIs they have, let alone what their whole attack surface is. Like, we can't even begin, like, you imagine Traceable, like, we can't sell you API security unless you know you've got an API. And while I can tell you, you probably do, and certainly, you know, Traceable works with you to like figure out what that looks like. Realistically, most of our customers think we might have an API. We probably have APIs. I don't know what the scope is. And that's where you can really, really start to realize how little you know and really start to worry about that attack surface. I think this is highlighted. We did a report. It's called the 2025 State of API Security. We spoke to a lot of different people in security to talk about how they're dealing with API security. And you can see that, you know, a lot of the reasons why respondents said APIs are at risk are things like because traditional security solutions are not effective, because the volume of APIs is really hard, and because they lack that knowledge of the attack surface. It's those unknowns, right? It's the vulnerabilities existing in software you didn't even know is own. I always tell this story, and I am going to tell it again. So I do a lot of bug bounty hunting, and part of what I do with bug bounty hunting is I go to these live hacking events. Now, these live hacking events get the best hackers in the world into a single room and get them to hack on a single company. The company pays for this, of course. And the company, you can imagine, are very, very mature in their security posture. This is not people just setting up AppSec programs. These are established programs. There are quite a few of these. They have a bonus, and the bonus is we didn't know we owned that, and it's rewarded whenever a hacker finds a vulnerability on something that they didn't even know that they owned. And lo and behold, I have never seen one of these events where that has not been claimed. Every single one I've been to, somebody has found something in the attack surface that the company didn't even know about. And again, we're not talking about basic AppSec stuff here. We're talking about major, major security teams, like security teams of hundreds of people potentially. So if you do want to check out the full report, I really do recommend it. It's a really, really interesting look into API security and how a lot of industries are kind of tackling it. And there's a lot of other stats in there. I'll talk a bit more about like how to use something like this in a bit, but I really want to put the link out there so you can take a look. It genuinely is quite interesting. And it has an EMEA separate report, so you can see the difference between the UK, the US, and EMEA. Now, fundamentally, what is our goal with that, with any type of API security program? Well, it's to control the chaos. The goal of security programs is not to get you to 100% secure. It's not even to get you to 30% secure. The idea is it helps tidy up what you're probably already doing into more defined goals, achievements, and requirements that your organization needs to be able to match. And it's not about solving for API security, right? API security or any security program has to be an evolving thing that works with your security teams, your developers, your management. It has to get everybody to get together. And I should say there's a lot of different ways to achieve this. You know, there are traditional security controls you're probably familiar with, firewalls. You might be familiar with SAS, the type of source code scanning, or DAS, the type of dynamic code scanning. You might be familiar with encryption or general ideas like authentication and access control. And honestly, this is not majorly changing any of this. There's a ton of different ways you can achieve this. And we'll see as we start to look at the kind of goals of API security, what some of those could be. Now, one of the most difficult parts of any security team's job is to work with developers. And I really want to stress this because some of what I'm going to say today is a bit of a hot take. It's a bit controversial because I'm going to fundamentally prioritize your relationship with development teams above potentially where other security people might do it. And I'll tell you why. Because APIs are so developer-led, they are so developer-focused, developers have a lot more ownership over a typical API than they do with most other products. Even more so, a lot of APIs may be managed by just one person. And of course, they feel a lot of ownership over it. They've made it, they've brought it up from the ground up, it's their child. So I think when we talk about API security, we need to be aware that it's not just us that we're affecting as a security team. We're adding a ton of workload onto developers. So we need to make sure that we are not like overstepping here, and we need to fundamentally make sure we have that relationship. And there are a few like tempting solutions here. One of the kind of main first steps, and again, I'll talk about this, is, well, you have a client and you have a server. So the API is on the server, your client can't be trusted, put security here. So that way, where it doesn't reach, like insecure stuff doesn't reach the server. And that's a really tempting solution. It's really tempting to go, I've just got a WAF, I'm solved. But API security solutions have to be more than just a single security control. Instead, we need to look at models like NIST, Cybersecurity Framework, to see what broadly we can think about more than just an individual security control. Now, I really recommend using a cybersecurity framework to help you structure this. I really like NIST because I think it's really nice and clear and simple, and it's really easy to tell somebody, hey, we're going to be following this model. There are tons of alternatives. OWASP has the software maturity model, which is a lot. But you've also got specific regulatory requirements, GDPR, PCI DSS, you've got ISO. Like, it's not just one model here. I'm going to show you what this can look like in this model, but you should totally have a look at some of these and expand it based on where you want to be, how your organization functions, what industries you work in, what that organizational risk, that compliance and maturity can look like. So hopefully this covered kind of the very broad overview. What is my API security timeline? Wow, the text on here does not look good. My apologies. So I think step one for any API security program is really about understanding those unknown unknowns. What don't you know about? How much of that API attack surface do you actually understand? And how are you like cataloging that risk? Step two is when you can start introducing your API security testing and protection. Now, often teams will just jump straight to testing and protection and go, problem solved. There is no point sending your developers 100 vulnerabilities if there is no way for them to actually fix those vulnerabilities, right? You want to get immediate results, absolutely. Like, especially if you paid for something, you paid for a tool. It seems weird to be stuck in risk assessments. However, if you don't have the fundamental building blocks in place, the API security testing and the API protection will always end up failing because you're not ready to support that kind of program yet. And then at the very end here, that's written in yellow, sorry, is API incident response and threat hunting for APIs. Now, this is where we see the most mature security teams. This is where your point of view changes from reactive, your API security testing, your API protection, into proactive. And honestly, between these three, there's like a year between them. This is not something that's going to be solved instantly. It's something that I believe is worth solving. API security has led to so many incidents and continues to. By the way, if you don't, there is a great newsletter, apisecurity.io, that does this fantastic weekly newsletter of all the API security vulnerabilities. It's a problem worth solving. However, we can take baby steps. So, no API security and no budget. This is probably where you are. You might have APIs and are using APIs. You probably know that APIs matter. You have no visibility into the governance of those APIs. That's the developer's management. You don't have any way to protect these APIs. They're usually very reactive security after an attack has taken place. You might keep logs, but you're probably not actually reviewing those logs to actually detect any incidents. You haven't got any incident response process set up that maybe might be separate from an organizational incident response process. And you don't really have any kind of recovery setup. Most organizations are here. Most organizations actually don't need more than the first goal here, but we'll see why and when a budget is kind of needed. So at this point, you've got no API security and no budget. Your goal is 1, understand what APIs you have. 2, discover your API attack surfaces. So that's internal APIs, external APIs, third party, and supply chain. And actually this year, we're seeing a ton of API incidents happen in that supply chain. And 3 is to find the person who owns those APIs or to assign it to somebody. So your focus is really about API inventory and governance. What do you have? Who owns it? Fundamental first step. Now, there's lots of different ways of achieving this. You could use automated tools and scanners. If you have budget, this is where an API security tool like Traceable can do quite a lot because it can give you that visibility into your API attack surface. But the third one here, of find out who owns them, that's not anything a tool can help you with. That is about how your organization fundamentally functions and how the security team reacts to development teams. So your API inventory at this point doesn't have to be complete, right? It's not about getting 100% visibility. The point is you spend some time finding those APIs, understanding how they're supposed to be used. You know, this is supposed to be internal or external. And honestly, it takes a long time to get this list. Like if you have a tool that can do this, like something like Traceable will sit and find API endpoints by watching the traffic. You don't need a tool though. So this is a really good opportunity for you to really get to know your development teams and really get to know some of the developers on that you're kind of going to be working with and build up that relationship. Because certainly security incidents put every relationship to the test, but especially that between security teams and developers. Now, some options: go to their desk, sit behind them, and see what they do. Other options: ask them, speak to them. You would not believe how many organizations are like, oh, we need to buy a tool for API security, and but we don't have budget. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see why a tool would be helpful, but have you tried just asking the developers? And they're like, no. We have a bad relationship. The development team doesn't have time. Be as unintrusive as possible into their time, but make those relationships. Great way to also look is code bases. So what code base is available? Look at GitHubs or GitLabs, whatever your organization uses. Look at what other applications are doing. Look for literally the word API. Ask around. On the governance side, really what we want to be able to do at this point is to assign it to an individual on the development or ops teams. Depends on the organization. Obviously, that might be the same person, but just give it to somebody. Maybe one person has several small APIs. Maybe we have somebody that has small APIs and one person that has one of the large APIs. It depends what makes sense for your team and your organization. The idea is, though, that they are now responsible for that API. Any security problems that you have, go to them. At this point, we're not taking away their agency. They have leadership over that. You are an asset to them, not adding to their workload. No CI/CD pipeline tools, no security tools, no scanners, no testing requirements. Don't force them to do anything. At this point, we need the development teams to buy into API security as a problem. And I think these two things, find the APIs and give it to somebody, can make such a huge difference in just making APIs more secure, because if something does happen, you can go to somebody. Now, this is where I say it's a bit controversial, because obviously I'm telling you not to fix the APIs. At this point, we don't necessarily want to fix them. And you might be thinking, but Katie, what if we're actually attacked? Look, APIs are just web applications. They're a little bit different. The IR plan is going to be different. Like, yes, when you are more mature, it will absolutely look different. However, right now, like, you probably have an organizational wide incident response plan. If not, make one. And then treat the API as any other application, right? Avoid panicking, just follow the plan. Now, obviously, this is not going to be the best response. Like, if there is an incident, you know, it's not going to be winning awards for how well an incident was handled. But it is just another type of application, right? APIs are special, and they're special in really unique ways. They're not that special, though. They're not that different, and they're not something that your team is unfamiliar with. And yes, we will get to your API testing and protection. But first, let's just make sure we understand that attack surface. So you know some of the APIs, you know the developer that knows the API, and maybe you have some AppSec tools that are already in place. Maybe you take logs, you don't review them, you're not really doing a specific incident response, but you have some idea of the recovery of the application. What can you do then? Okay, so your goal is to, one, start to protect APIs blocking bad input. There are a lot of free WAFs that it's not going to block API specific attacks, right? It's not going to block the majority of like API specific stuff. However, it will be something, and something for very cheap. And especially if you already pay for a WAF, it won't hurt. And two is recognizing sensitive data and really starting to categorize and risk assess your APIs. So your focus here is really about block and categorize. So WAFs usually already available from other applications. You might have already paid for one. You may as well stick it in front of the API. You know, it's not going to work for a lot of API attacks, but it's better than nothing. You might also want to think about what other blocking strategies you have. You don't do business outside the UK? Well, maybe geo-blocking might be a good choice because you get a lot of connections from outside the UK. And on the other hand, you have really starting to understand your risk. So categorize your APIs, give them a risk score. What data do they handle? What other systems they connect to? What regulatory requirements do you have? This is how you get your executive sponsorship for doing an API security project. Give them the raw numbers and the risk. And everyone tells me, I don't have budget. And I'll be honest, at this point, it's really hard to go on without any budget. It's not impossible, though. This is a great opportunity to advocate for a budget. You know, it doesn't necessarily need to be budgeting for a tool. It could be budgeting people's time. Using things like the state of API security, apisecurity.io, you can really start to get into the raw numbers and say, hey, look, this is a problem. Here are the numbers. Here are the risks that our APIs have at the moment. I need to control this better because this could be a serious incident. And in terms of like how much API security attacks can hurt, they can really hurt. They can really, really like, if you look at something like, I mean, we've got, you know, Web3 projects that lost their entire vault of crypto, right? We've got data breaches where everybody's data has been leaked. You know, these can be really expensive attacks, but fundamentally, you're not going to get budget for anything if you can't represent that first. So I'm still going to talk about some cheaper options, but just bear that in mind that this is where it starts to get tough. So maybe we have some budget, right? We at least understand the API attack surface risk. Hopefully at this point you have executive leadership alignment on API security being a thing worth talking about, even if you don't have budget in pounds. You have some accept tools that you're using in place of API security tools, but again, you're not really doing anything on the detect, respond, recover. Now, at this point, your goal should be to, one, implement API specific security tools if you have them. But secondly, to ensure an API inventory is complete, specifically alert for new APIs and endpoints. This is how you really start to get on top of your API attack surface, by having an alert that just says, hey, by the way, this new API has come out. Knowing that gives you so much power. And that doesn't have to be through an API security tool. That could also be through the way developers communicate with you. It's just about knowing where that attack surface is and just knowing, hey, this is going to be a problem. Then you can start to update an API risk assessment based on API specific tooling. So something like Traceable, we give you a risk number based on how your APIs, or what sensitive data your APIs handle. You don't need an API tool for that. You can do that manually. But again, it's about getting, that supportive tool use. You're better off spending money on tools that everyone will be happy with than trying to buy an entire toolbox and for really specific problems. If something is working, just keep at it. There's no reason to change it, not at this point anyway, because if it works, it works. At this point, you should be relatively confident that you have this visibility into your APIs. You're now ready to start thinking about a more proactive approach. So you're kind of thinking long-term vision. And it might be really tempting to focus on API testing tools. Find more vulnerabilities, that's good. But there is a significant dev time, false positive, and risk management balance you have to reach before you can realistically implement API testing tools. We don't fix every security hole, so we're not going to fix every API security issue, right? Some of it is going to be more important, and yeah, absolutely, that should get fixed. But everything, it's just not realistic. Again, it's the APIs you don't know about and the APIs you don't know the security status of that is the real risk more than anything else. Ooh. Okay, so you have budget. What next? Right. So while you may start to have your API security tools that maybe aren't API specific, you can now start to look at those kind of like API security tools. And honestly, the two goals here are testing and protection. Find vulnerabilities and get them fixed, and then block API security attacks. So instead of relying on tools that aren't built for APIs, this is when it's time to bring in API testing. Now, what's test and when? It depends on how your security program is set up. Here are some ideas, but certainly, this is just thinking kind of very long term into a bunch of different things you can do. Having some API specific tools, though, is really important here because you can get quite a lot of attacks with traditional testing. You're not going to get those API security attacks. Now, API protection is really about blocking API attacks. And again, this is really tough to achieve because you get some of it with a WAF, but you really do need that API context to block API attacks. API attacks are kind of fundamentally just fraud. They don't really have clear signatures. They're really based on how an application works and functions within an ecosystem. Now, obviously, it's a bit weird to only focus on protection now. Honestly, most attacks can be reasonably dealt with existing tools if you have that visibility. Visibility is really key, and when I speak to customers, that's kind of where a lot of them start and the problem they're really trying to solve. Like, if you can start your visibility from as soon as you have access to an API security tool and then you just stick on protection because it's just something else, fantastic, excellent. If you don't have that, it's about now thinking about those actual incidents. It's about having that long-term view. Most attacks are going to come from that API attack surface you don't realize you have, not the ones you do, because that's a controlled risk. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other steps here, but I'm going to talk about what I consider best-in-class API security. So your goal for best-in-class API security is all of that, plus API incident response plans. So knowing that you have that protection in place, but fundamentally this last one, reviewing those logs. When you think about the most mature API security programs, they are not having an incident and going, well, that sucks. They are looking back at an incident and making changes based on it. And your API security tool, or even your program in general, has to support that goal. And finally, but if you are really, really thinking kind of best in class API security, proactively reviewing API usage to recognize breaches or attackers before they attack, flag API abuse and API abusers and threat actors, if you can start to categorize what you're seeing and really start to have that long-term vision, that is best in class API security. And actually, when you think about it, that's not that hard to achieve once you have your protection and testing. This is just have somebody have some free time to review logs. Now, again, this is like best in class. You don't need best in class. Doing something will always be better than nothing. Doing the smallest amount of API security is going to pay off. You don't need to buy something, you don't need to spend a lot in order to get API security. It helps, it really, really helps, but you don't need it. And if you're looking at all of this thinking, yeah, my organization is not ready to talk about API protection, get it. Totally. Start somewhere. Start with discovery. Start with understanding your API attack surface, even if that's just figuring out from your teammates, hey, how many APIs do we actually have? Does anyone know what data they store? That's some of the easiest things to do that you can get like a huge reward from. So thank you very much. Hopefully I've waffled on enough. If you have any questions, please do throw them in the Q&A section. And I'm sure other Katie will be able to help me answer or get them to me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katie. That was so informative, and it really did show how important API security is, and it doesn't matter where you are in your journey. You know, you should start now, and it starts with discovery. And so if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat. And I will also be sharing the link to the State of 2025 API Security Report with everyone afterwards in some follow-up after the email, in a follow-up email after the webinar. I think we probably do have time for one or two questions. And I do have one that I wanted to ask throughout. And I was thinking, Katie, what is one of the biggest mistakes that you see organizations make when it comes to API security?
Not caring. Well, there's two sides. Not caring about it fundamentally. I think I talk to a lot of organizations that only really think about API security when they've thought about literally everything else in their security program. They're like, gee, what's next? I'll just do APIs. And then they don't realize they've actually been exploited via their API for months and they've not noticed. So I think firstly, forgetting API security, and I think it doesn't come from like a negative place. It comes from a place of like APIs are slightly weird. They live in slightly weird areas. It does require quite a lot of communication between security teams and developers, or between developers, to really start to understand that. And I think it also intimidates people a lot. They think, oh, like the APIs are huge, I don't want to think about it, they're mostly internal anyway, so it doesn't matter. I think that kind of attitude. And I think the other attitude, which I'm going to say people with money make, is just buy a product, buy API security product, and then think they have API security and forget that there is a whole lot more work that has to be done there to really start to tackle API security, because it doesn't matter if you have the best scanning tool in the world. If you don't have a way to remediate those vulnerabilities, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you block every single API attack, even if that was like possible. Even if you block every single attack, if you're not addressing those root causes, it doesn't matter. So those are my two kind of things, is like buying something expecting it to solve everything, and not caring enough to do anything.
I think that's really valid. And I think when it comes to, having organizations where they maybe don't necessarily care as much to do anything, how would you recommend someone who perhaps has been on this webinar, they actually, realize API security is actually a massive issue? How would you recommend they approach their team maybe or them higher up? Do you have any advice on that?
So my number one piece of advice is like bring numbers, like
Okay.
bring the stats. I think that, and I think a lot of organizations are right to do this. People are very skeptical if you want to change the way they work,
Mm-hmm.
on literally just, oh, I think API security matters. I don't blame organizations for doing that. I think you have got to come armed with data. Like you've got to go look at the reports, look at some of the other breaches, read about some of the other breaches, especially within your sector as well. Like if you work in, I don't know, like the oil and gas industry, when there was a major ransomware breach on an oil pipeline that shut it down for days and cost millions, that's a really compelling reason to want to invest in security. Like that's much more of a reason than I just kind of feel like we need it. And I think you've really got to go in with arms and like upskill yourself on like why it matters, and then figure out how am I going to explain this to somebody. And my number one recommendation is always put it in a slide deck. Slide decks really help organize your thoughts. So if you put it in a slide deck, you'll probably find that you're able to tell the story of, here's why I care about API security and why I think you should as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Katie. I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone who joined us on this webinar has learned a lot. Now, if you are on the webinar and we finish up now, and then you suddenly get a question this evening, please do not hesitate to get in touch. I've put my email address in the chat, and what I'll do is I'll reach out to Katie and the team at Traceable, and we'll get your questions answered. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part, and I hope you all have a lovely day and look after your APIs. Thank
Thank
you
you so
very
much,
much.
everybody.